Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the next episode of A Brief History of Everything. I am Chris. I am here, as always, with the one and only Thomas. How are we?
Good, Chris. How are you?
I am wonderful. So we are, obviously, just for global perspective, we are not recording in the same room because we are back in lockdown.
Lockdown, woo!
Woo, lockdown! But you know, COVID and viruses cannot prevent us from giving you the next episode of the American half century. And I feel this is a big one too. This is kind of a very eventful phase in American history. I mean, it's very hard to find a phase of American history that's not eventful. But I think more than any other, this is the sort of 10-year period that shapes a large amount of what America is going to be.
Yeah, if you want a dividing point off American history, I think the Great Depression, 1929, it becomes a separation between an old America and a new America, and it falls right smack bang in the center of so many national narratives as well. I think a lot of countries define themselves from the Great Depression onwards and what happens as a consequence of that.
Yeah, I think that the Great Depression, I mean, first of all, it's a globally framed event, obviously, and the ripple effect of the Great Depression globally can be seen. I mean, you can see it in things such as, you know, and we'll get into, obviously, we're heading towards a global conflict. We're heading towards World War II. And a lot of countries look back, when you look back at a lot of countries and what happens with them, the Great Depression is a massive turning point. Because of, and as we'll get into now, the idea of the American loans that were out and the way that America had sort of been financing a lot of the economy, even though they were isolationist, they weren't isolated from other people's money. And this is an important thing to remember. American banks loved foreign money. It was the way they kept themselves afloat.
No, they just love foreign oil.
Exactly. Foreign oil, foreign money. They liked all those things. Even if they didn't like the countries, you know, it's a bit like, you know, Adam Sandler in The Wedding Singer. I like money. I have some. I keep it in a box. I'd like more. This is where you come in. And it's very much that with American banks and American loans. And they prop up countries like, you know, Germany, for example, which is seeing its own massive turnaround at the time and has got this sort of, they've gone from this hyperinflation in Germany to what seems to be a very prosperous situation. Now, that leads us in nicely to our starting point, which is sort of where we finished the last episode, which was prosperity, but it wasn't the word prosperity by itself. It was prosperity with a question mark on it.
That sort of notion of deceptive prosperity or relative prosperity, which we often use when talking about the German situation, certainly applies here. And the notion that what we have is a form of prosperity, but looking back as historians are wont to do, you can see that the tiles are falling off the roof, not so much the walls are falling in.
Yeah. So we sort of covered a fair bit in the last episode relating to the reasons, but we're going to go back into them now because we need to dig deep. Because there's a general question to ask, which is the Great Depression and is the stock market crash the same thing? Because whenever you talk about the Great Depression, people automatically go to the the crash in 1929, which seems to make a lot of sense until you do a bit more digging. And when you go back and look at that American economy, which we talked about in the last episode, use of credit, all the extra spending on credit in particular that we saw in the United States, the fact that it wasn't about having the money, it was about credit. And don't worry, you can always pay that credit back because that money would keep the economy ticking over and keep the economy ultra strong. That was the first point. But the second point was America never really, in many areas that they deem important, agriculture, for example, they never really rebound from World War I. You know, the American agricultural sector overproduces food because of World War I and then finds itself trying to make up that deficit all the way through the next 10 years almost.
Yeah, what we see is that the agricultural situation, not to go into too much detail, as we probably covered this quite well in the previous podcast, the agricultural situation was never fully recovered. And while we have this sort of large, broad stroke narrative of an America that is prosperous and wealthy and growing, we really have just pockets of growth. Now, many pockets, but pockets nonetheless. It's not a whole-scale economic recovery from World War One. It's the feelings of those sort of steroids that have been injected into certain sort of economic pockets that have really allowed that growth to occur, compounded with the Dust Bowl of the 1920s and 30s. The agricultural situation is not much better than what it was pre-World War One. What is also important, you touched on there, Chris, was the amount of debt that is starting to circulate in the economy. A lot of the wealth off the stock market is being generated in the latter half of the 20s by borrowing on the margin, where the banks were setting out massive amounts of loans to regular consumers to borrow money to buy stocks on the expectation that the stock would rise faster and more than the loan's life itself. And so as a consequence, you could pay off the loan and actually make a profit. Now, never in the history of anything has borrowing on a credit card to pay off another credit card to try and make money on that first credit card ever worked. And what we see here is that.
And I mean, the point is they made the overall statistics are staggering. Speculators borrowed $9 billion for speculating in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
That's never a good idea.
No.
Like the idea of let's borrow $9 billion to see if we can turn that into $9.5 billion. That's crazy.
It's expecting never-ending growth. And the other thing I've got a lot to say about economists, but one thing is they like to use fancy words to cover up more lay terms. Speculation is gambling. There's no way around it. You can doll it up and put a nice veneer on it, put a bow on top and call it speculation. It is purely and utterly gambling. You might as well have taken that $9 billion, gone down to your nearby casino, put it on Black 28, and then hope to ride that all the way to the bank.
And this is the thing, is that you've got a situation where the share price is not only rising, but it's rising to levels that are completely unsustainable. You've got between 24 and 29, the value is 5 times is the increase of the market. That is not sustainable. There are businesses floating market options out there simply because they know there's money out there. There are stories about companies that there's one company, for example, that floated their South American mine, which didn't exist, but they floated it and made an absolute killing of people gambling on the margin. And this is the thing. Everybody thought that there was no such thing as a bad investment. And people then who may not have been scrupulous, shall we say, floated businesses that maybe were about to fall apart or weren't strong because they knew that all business value on the market was hyperinflated. But as long as everyone pretended that it was working, it worked. And so people were going to make this money back. And you got this ridiculous amount. So you get about 600,000 speculators by 1929, which is the highest level of involvement in the market, by the way, we've ever seen. It's important to note, not everybody, in fact, a majority of people were not in the market at the time. So this is where we're going to talk about the market and the Great Depression. We are going to sort of separate them, but bring them back together. Purely from who lost money on shares, it's about 600,000 on the market, which is a lot, but compared to the American population, not substantial. But it's the amount of money. That's the concern.
Yeah.
Furthermore, which we'll get to in one moment, when the crash happens, it's what happens as a result of that to the companies that were floated. That's the bigger issue.
Yeah. While it might only be 600,000 investors, the important fact to remember is that everyone uses banks. And it's the actions and behaviors of the banks that make this from something that could have been contained to something that is uncontainable. But it's not actions within the thrust of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. It's actions taken by the banks throughout the 1920s that are the problem. And so again, as historians looking back, you can see this all unfolding and wonder why no one stopped it. But the reason no one stopped these things happening in the first place is because it had the appearance and probably the real effect that this growth was happening because of these actions. So why stop these actions if it's producing the good?
Okay.
Only later do you realize the long-term consequence is complete and utter financial collapse.
And the interesting thing is that a lot of people, like a lot of revisionist historians, sit there and go, oh, 1929, October, it was a sudden day. It wasn't sudden at all. There had been a near collapse in March. The market had gotten very shaky in March. And then the economist Roger Babson had made a comment in September where he said the market's going to fall over here. Like, we're in trouble. And the only reason that it doesn't, and this is where we're going to get into the banks went out and en masse bought large amounts of stock. And the reason they did this was to refloat that market, to give it the impression, as Thomas just indicated there, that everything was working. So as the market starts to wobble and economists more and more start pointing at the market and going, guys, we've got a problem here. The banks are the ones who paper over the cracks and go, nonsense, we're great. Look, and they just buy more shares going, well, if we pump more money in, everyone will go, oh, it must be strong, and keep buying.
Yeah, what we see the banks really with their hands in both the cookie jar and the cake, to really blend a couple of metaphors there. By the 1925 onwards, the banks have done two what we would now call criminal things. First of all, they had used their depositors' money to loan out money to potential investors, so that 600,000 investors are using the funds of the deposits of the millions and millions of Americans who have put their money into banks. The second thing they've done is the banks themselves have borrowed money against themselves to buy those stocks. So essentially, these banks are insolvent. They've got no money, because once the downturn starts, the savings of largely 1 in 10 Americans is wiped out, and the other 9 in 10 are getting 10 cents on the dollar that they've deposited. So when we talk about the crunch, yes, the 600,000 investors lose their money and the billions of money in the stock crash, but the long-term effects are your average Americans have lost millions upon millions upon millions of dollars because the banks have just been free form, letting anyone use it for whatever purpose, and with the losses, that money has disappeared.
So the way it all starts to fall apart is the Senate starts to investigate. The Senate afterwards, investigating the crash, found that the brokers and the banks were not only slightly giving information, it was deep level insider trading. That the brokers and the banks were giving each other that information, like, you'll stock this up, we'll back this up, we'll do this. So again, the market was a complete fabrication. Like, what was going on, and this was found by the Senate after the fact, that basically the market didn't exist as a thing. It was a complete fabrication, and the numbers were just made up by brokers and banks because they were getting more out of it. The banks were obviously getting people taking loans. The brokers were getting brokerage loans and getting percentages of the cut. So it made more sense to do it. But obviously, Thursday, 24th of October, 13 million shares are sold in an absolute panic, and the market crashes. Now, the banks decided they were going to try to fix this. So by the Monday, the banks decide they're going to try to buy more stock and once again put the market up. It doesn't work because everybody keeps selling on the Monday, and eventually the banks just go, we can't save this. It's not worth throwing more money at. And the banks pull any further investments out of the market, which completely collapses the idea. And by the 29th of October, the market goes down and 16 million shares go.
Yeah, so in a period of 4 days, they've broken twice the record amount of stocks traded, which starts to show the panic that's setting in, as opposed to the quote-unquote rational investment that had got them to that point.
Now, we asked at the start, Great Depression and stock market crash, are they the same thing? One of the things that we both find as teachers, for example, is that I think a lot of students automatically equate, when you say the Great Depression, they talk about the stock market crash. And it makes a lot of sense. It's quite logical, but they are able to be separated to some extent as well. The stock market crash is an event within the Great Depression. It is not the entirety of the Great Depression. It is, the straw that broke the camel's back, because we're going with our metaphors today. the camel that stirred the drink of the cake, however you want to.
And it's not a one-time plastic use straw either.
No, it's not a one-time plastic use straw at all. It's an interesting thing to have a bit of a look at. Is why does the stock market crash? Why is it the event that is the catalyst for what is seen as the Great Depression? And again, a small number of people lose their money in the stock market. It's about what's about to happen to everybody else in the United States because the banks are the ones funding the whole thing. That's where the Great Depression is going to hit. And that's why the two events are clearly intrinsically linked. Is that the banks are about to start falling over one at a time because the banks are completely reliant on the money from the markets. And once the money from the markets goes, they're in a lot of trouble. And it didn't take a lot. This is the other thing I find quite interesting, and we will discuss this in a bit more depth when we get to banking regulation, which will come up. You didn't really need much to declare yourself a bank, which feels bizarre by today's standards. But like the onus of proof on you to say you were a bank was largely, did you say you had enough money to cover everybody, and that was it.
Yeah, I got some cash in my pocket. I'm a bank. I'm a walking, talking bank.
I own a vault.
Nothing in it, but I own a vault.
I own a vault. I've got a shop front. I call that person at the front counter a teller. This is a bank, completely. The first national bank. This is what this is. Banking regulation was not a thing. No one believed you needed to, be able to back the banks. That wasn't a thing because the banks had plenty of money. Why would you need to back the banks? And banks were going to be honest with people's money because their job was to look after it. And they were going to be completely, honest about the way they looked after money. Now, again, this is the time where the global confidence in the economy in the 20s has been sky high. And this is the moment where everyone takes their step back and goes, oh, maybe this isn't as secure as we thought it was.
Yeah, and you see the response to these inherent flaws of unbridled capitalism in FDR's New Deal, which we will get to further down the line. Some of the institutions that he brings in that are still in place today are to combat this, look, I would call it criminal and deceptive behaviours. A more right-leaning person might call it, say, the odd apple that is rotten, but the rest are good. Either way, regulation is seen as the solution to this, largely, which comes in and stays in up until the 1990s, with some of it even still being here today.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because obviously the subprime mortgage thing happens in the 2000s, and I was thinking about this last night, and when you go back and look at the subprime mortgage thing, and people go, oh, we could never have predicted this was going to happen. It literally happened in 1929. Like it's literally what happened in 1929. The difference was this time it wasn't market speculation in terms of the stock market. It was mortgage speculation, right? That's the difference between the two of them, right? One of them is pure market speculation and encouraging people to take out money to invest on the market. In the other one, it's encouraging people to take out money to invest in property. But two sides of the same coin. Now, I think it's really interesting to have a discussion about causes because the causes have changed over time and economists that have different things. My favorite is of course, everybody's favorite 1920s, 1930s economic mind. I'm talking, of course, about John Maynard Keynes. Now, Keynes, his argument was that if people had just kept spending, this wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, Keynes is a bit of a hero of mine because I quite like his, at least the philosophy that underpins his economics. And he made so many calls that both in hindsight and with foresight were correct. He called the fact that the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh economically, not morally or intrinsically, but too harsh on Germany. And he pinpointed exactly how much they would be able to pay using, economic modeling, how much they wouldn't be able to pay. And he said, if you do $1 over this, the whole thing will fall apart, X, Y, Z, and in 15, 20 years later, we'll be back at war, which is exactly what happens. He's on the economic advisory side of the Treaty of Versailles. so too does he propose to all the nations going through the economic downturn, the best way to get out of it is by just massive government spending, rack up government debt, get people employed, get them working, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when he says go out and keep spending, his caveat is if the people can't spend, then the government needs to fill the gap. And that's where Hoover becomes a serious, serious problem, and the Republican economic policies become a serious problem. Their philosophy is the role of the government is not to fill in that gap, that's just a market correction. And so Keynes is once again proved largely correct that if there's a void of spending, either the market will contract backwards, which is what it does, or the government needs to inject themselves and spend like crazy to keep that void from being eliminated, so to speak.
And that's the thing. We saw that again, to go back to 2007, economies that put money into the economy rather than go, no, don't spend anything, rode out the bumps. The biggest issue I have with the idea of the Keynes saying the problem was that people stopped spending was that spending was what had got them into the problem in the first place. And it's a double-edged sword there. It's the only way to get out of it once you're in it. And
spending off their debt, though, that's the caveat here. If they hadn't been borrowing recklessly, and like such as borrowing on the margin, and then spending money they didn't have, then all of a sudden they've got they're spending legitimate, actual value money, not speculation money, and so a contraction would have been far less severe. Now,
as part of the response, the other economist I always love having conversations around is, of course, Milton Friedman. Because Friedman's always good for a conversation or two. Now Friedman blames the Fed. He blames the Fed because his argument is that the Fed's response was to raise the interest rate. And because of raising the interest rate, it basically reduced the amount of money in the economy, which again, sort of it follows along the Keynesian lines of the way to get out of this is have money in the economy. And Friedman's argument is, well, they reduced the amount of money in the economy. So once they pulled the amount of money back, there's no money in the economy. No one can spend to get out of it. We're in bigger trouble. And I love his line again, that the Fed put the word great in the Great Depression. They got in there. Now, the other thing that Friedman mentions is, I think, really important, and we'll get to this as part of the reactions to the Great Depression. The gold standard and the links of the American dollar to the gold standard. Now, this ideally means that your money is backed. But the problem with this is that when you've got a market made up of, let's use the word imaginary numbers, binding imaginary numbers to a real property makes it very inflexible to get yourself out of the danger. And one of the problems that America does have, which exacerbates the problem of the Great Depression, is the gold standard. And a way out of it, which was, so obviously the biggest problem for the United States with the Great Depression, there's two. There's a domestic and there's a international. Domestically, we'll come to when we talk about Herbert Hoover, and we're going to have a long conversation around Herbert Hoover. Let's quickly do the international side of this. So foreign banks fall over because America needs money. So America starts going to all the other places that they've loaned all this money to. Hey, guys, you know those loans we gave you that we said, don't worry about paying us back. We're all, yeah, can we have that money? Like now, please? We need that money like this minute. Germany's economy collapses in a heap because America goes, all that money that we've invested in, no, we'll take that back. You get Britain starts to wobble because Britain's got a lot of loans back and forward with the United States post-World War I. It starts to wobble. Britain, by the way, claims all their money back from Australia, and that's where you get in Australia the infamous Jack Lang saying he's going to defend the banks with the army because they want to take all the loans back, and Jack Lang, the New South Wales Prime Minister, goes, no, you can't have it. You can't have my money. Forget it. Get out of here. You did those deals. That's on you. Global economies start to wobble. There is a conversation around how to get out of it. And basically, they all agree, we can do this, but you need to break away from the gold standard. And if you move away from the gold standard, we'll do it. So the Brits move away from their backing of their currency. All the other global economies move away from backing. And America goes, nah, and stays linked.
What the best way to conceptualize it, with so much generation of wealth in the US, they needed to find equal and more gold and pull it out the ground.
Yeah.
Like, if you've got a stock that's worth $1 today and $5 at the end of the week, and someone trades that stock in for cash, well, that cash needs to be redeemable for gold. So where's that extra $5 gold come from?
Yep.
The other thing about the gold standard and US history, and I know we won't get into this at all here, but it's a fascinating history. We think that the left-right divide has always been what's divided US politics. For a solid 50 to 100 years, it was silver standard and gold standard that divided politics in America. And if anyone wants to do a deep dive into that, go and read about the history of US politics in the Gilded Age, so post-Lincoln and post-Civil War. Mm-hmm. Such a fascinating read about the debates about the silver and gold standard. And then who is the economist saying that everyone needs to move away from it and move toward what's called fiat currency, where it's almost like imaginary currency? It's Keynes.
Yep. And that's the thing. Like, one of the saddest things is we're probably not going to get the ability, obviously, later on down the track after we finish this series to dive into that. Because as a podcast topic, it's a little dry. But
just a little.
In terms of interesting, it's deeply interesting. If you are interested in how America became what it is economically and like the way this political divide happens, it is a fascinating conversation. And the fact that can be, it's a narrative that's not discussed. When you're talking about the divide in America and what makes America what it is, it's a conversation that's not really discussed broadly, but it's far more important than almost 3/4 of the conversations that people have about what makes America America, because it is sort of a big turning point for them.
Yeah, there's those sort of big debates that define politics. You know, in the very founding of America, it's states' rights versus creation of a strong central government, so federalism versus statism. Then it moves on to slavery. Then it moves on to the gold and silver standard. And then it moves on to America's place in the world, which is what we will largely cover here, isolationist or big police force for the world. These debates are far more telling of the American story than sort of more specific, nuanced narratives that you can find.
So obviously, when we're talking about the Great Depression, most of the impacts we see are going to be on the everyday people. It's going to be on the majority of the population. Now, we've talked a lot about wealth and we've talked a lot about the market. There's 1.5 million stock market shareholders. There's 600,000 speculators. So not a huge swathe of about 123 to 125 million people at the time. But one of the reasons why it's so telling is who owns the wealth. So a majority of this wealth in the United States at the time is about the top 5% of the people who own a majority of the wealth. And what makes it even worse is 40% of the population at the time are in poverty. So their opportunity to move up is non-existent. And what's about to happen is that a large percentage of the population is about to join them. So what we're about to see with the United States is there's a wealth gap to start with, obviously, 40% poverty, 5% with all the wealth. And then you don't really have the ability to do anything for the 40%, which is, a huge number of people, obviously, living in poverty. And then governments don't want to spend because they've got no money and there's no ability to do so. There's no jobs because companies are collapsing. There's no ability to loan money because banks aren't giving out any money. They don't have any. So what you're going to see is that even though the 40% really were the ones that weren't doing anything, like they had nothing to do with this, the flow-on effect from the Great Depression hits them hardest.
Mm-hmm. As I sort of detailed earlier, your average American is losing their life savings because they did the right thing and deposited in a bank that they trusted. The other thing that really bites them is the government's or intended policy, as well as the natural consequence of an event like this, which is deflation, where the government and the market pushes down the prices of goods and services, thinking that, well, with rising unemployment and rising poverty, cheaper goods and cheaper services will not only allow the common person who now has less money to afford the necessities of life, but hopefully that will spur on a resurgent economic growth. Turns out that when you drive down the price of goods, it means you have to drive down the wage of the person producing that goods, and then that means there's actually less money going around the economy rather than more. And this is what really hurts Japan, which we'll probably come to later. But Japan's involvement in the Great Depression and the severity of it in Japan is primarily down to a chosen policy of deflation as opposed to anything else.
And the other thing too, like the reason why I brought up the agricultural sector so early on and really wanted to get into the fact that these things like agriculture and textiles in particular were massively struggling is because when the Great Depression hits, as deflationary policy hits, these industries which were in big trouble before all of this happened cannot survive. And so you get the collapse of the agricultural industry in the United States and the complete decimation of the textiles industry. Those two industries then lead to high levels of unemployment. It means you get people moving out of rural areas and trying to move into city areas to try to find work, which leads to the over-influx into the cities, which means there's no jobs in the cities, which also then leads to things like Hoovervilles. So
Hooverville.
Can I just say, I really like the fact that, you know, when in crisis, name something after the person you blame.
Yeah, blame the person.
And the Hooverville. So the Hooverville, of course, are the shanty towns that pop up all over the place for all of these people to live while they are looking for work. Now, who was feeding them? Well, you'd like to think it was the federal government. And they were indeed federal government soup kitchens set up, but they were the secondary ones. Who is the great hero that America needs? Who is the man that is going to ride to their rescue? Why, it's Al Capone, who has made a lot of money, obviously, off prohibition, which is also a thing at this time still. And Al Capone, the gangster, legitimate boss, he...
Alleged gangster,
definitely guilty of tax evasion. We'll talk about that in a moment. Capone uses some of these ill-gotten gains to set up the first soup kitchens in New York and Chicago, and really sort of is seen by a lot of the lower classes then as a bit of a hero because he's the first person to actually go, let's just feed these people.
Yeah, the emergence, again, this is about voids emerging and void filling. A void emerges where largely in the stomachs of people, they are hungry. And here comes a guy who goes, I'm pretty shady, but here's a way to make myself look less shady. Yep. I mean, classic criminal. These days we talk about laundering money. Capone is laundering his own image here.
Oh, completely.
Becoming a hero of the people for the purposes of being able to sort of maintain his criminal enterprise, because who's going to rat him out if he's the one feeding him?
And also, he gets a lot of people who could potentially run a lot of rum for him. So, you know, it works out beautifully for him. And look, it's obviously allegedly committed dozens upon hundreds of crimes and murders. Obviously, only ever found guilty of tax, which is what he went to prison for and died in prison of. So, which is always one of my favorite things is that, you know, notorious gangster Al Capone, tax evasion. It's one of my favorite pieces of historical information. So what did the government do if, you know, obviously this is a problem of their making? Well, you need a man who is bound for the moment. You need a man who is born for this. You need a man who has got a lot of experience in government. You need a man who's got a lot of experience in elected office of leading the people. Unfortunately, Herbert Hoover is in charge. And Hoover, as we've mentioned in the last episode, his first elected office was President of the United States.
Yeah, this is the troubling thing about Hoover. On paper, he should be a guy who can meet this challenge. He's like the archetype of a businessman with a kind streak. Like, he's a great philanthropist. He led the charge in the recovery of Europe after World War I, putting food into mouths over there. He should be able to do it here, even if he has to turn his back ever so slightly on the sort of the Republican economic policies of the time and go, you know what, let's put this on pause and then reevaluate it. Let's just fix this problem, which he eventually does, but too slowly and too late.
He's a man without a country is the best way, I think, to describe Herbert Hoover. He's a man without a country. His own personal morals and his own personal beliefs indicate that his genuine interest in this was, I've just got to work out a way to feed people. And he wanted to do the right thing. He was also bound firmly by a Republican Party that believed they could spend their way out of trouble. Save their way out of trouble, first of all. They wanted to save as much as they could, and we'll just use this backlog of cash and things will fall over. But once they all fall over, will be great. Like, just let some of these people disappear. I find it really interesting because there are the two ways to go about it. So you've got, obviously, America has this capitalist bent of, when we're not going to steer away from laissez-faire economics, we're going to stay the course. We believe
market correction and all the good stuff.
The cleanness of the market will fix this up. Compare that to the Soviet Union. They go very hard on war communism, looking like there's going to be a full-on rebellion and revolution happening. Lenin takes a pause, looks around the country and goes, new economic policy, guys. Look, I know it's very capitalist in nature, but we're going to need to do this for a little bit just to make sure we can be communists. And I find it really interesting, the two, because like, you don't ever associate the name Lenin with strong economic management, but it's probably a damn sight stronger in terms of the way that they just pivoted away from their beliefs for, pragmatism, than what you get with the Great Depression and the Republican Party. Not so much even Hoover. We'll talk about Hoover in a minute, but just the Republican Party. They are not prepared to move away from their base value, even if it means the country is going to collapse around them. They're going to stick to their policy.
Yeah, and by sticking, you have 1,000 arguments about what causes it. Leave that aside. What's the approach to the solution? Certainly sticking to what got you there is a bad choice as opposed to an okay or even a good choice. How many times have we said to a person, well, you can keep doing the same thing and get the same results? That famous Einstein quote, people do the same thing expecting different results. They're the crazy ones. Well, maybe this time the crazy ones are the Hoovers and the Republicans, because they might have taken this as an opportunity to learn from themselves. Instead, no, let's just continue to do the same thing, because the cause of the problem is certainly going to be the solution to the problem.
And so there's a couple of ways to look at this. And the first one is, we've talked a lot about the isolationist nature of the United States. And obviously you've got a global economy situation that's now increasingly shaky. And again, even though there is an attempt to blame Europe, which Herbert Hoover tries, arguing that the European financial collapse in 1931 was the real cause. It wasn't him, it was Europe falling over, to which most economists went, yeah, but Herbert, you triggered the European collapse. That was but they try to blame Europe later on. That doesn't obviously stick, because everyone understands the reasoning behind it. But the way out, as I said before, there's a discussion globally about moving away from the gold standard, which all the other countries go, we can do that. America won't. That screws up international trade. The other thing is, America, as we said in the last episode, had been a manufacturing juggernaut. And their argument was, you need to trade with us because we've got the goods, so you need to trade with us. Now, a way out of this for the United States was to instead try to open up global trade and try to move the economy around globally and jumpstart it through trade. So what the Republican Party decides to do at this moment, when everything is really up against it, and we know that global trade is the way that they can probably get themselves out of it, they pass the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930.
Because anyone knows the solution to downturn in trade is to whack on tariffs.
So they raise the tariffs for all products again coming into the United States, and are shocked and angered by the fact that 60 countries respond to this by raising tariffs on American goods. And they're like, how dare you shut down the global economy? That's disgusting. What are we supposed to do?
You're supposed to buy from us. We're not supposed to buy from you. What are you doing?
What are you doing, guys? Why are you raising tariffs? That's not fair. It's remarkably stupid. And it's, for me, in all of the reactions and responses to the Great Depression, nothing is as mind-numbing to me as Smoot-Hawley. It is the dumbest thing they could have done. And when everyone responds in kind, they can't work out why. It's staggering.
Yeah, it just goes to show also the level of globalization that started to kick in at even such an early stage of the 20th century. I think most people will associate globalization with the post-World War II phenomenon. You start to see here that it's really kicked off, because why is it that an economic downturn or a Wall Street crash over a period of 4 days has such a flow-on effect down the line. It's because the economies of the world are really starting to get more and more entwined, ignoring the USSR for the period of time. Every other country is really starting to lean on each other for this, that, and the other. I mean, you take the 1890s, to jump back even further, the 1890s depression was just as big as the Great Depression in America, but the entire world economy didn't come to a grinding halt then, and it didn't last even nearly as long. What you do see with the Great Depression is the consequences of entanglement, and the consequences of entanglement by the end of the 1930s are not just going to be economic, it's going to be military.
And this is a broader point again. When we talk about the isolationist nature of the United States, it's kind of misleading. In fact, not kind of misleading, it's incredibly misleading, because the United States is really the country that creates this global economy. All the way they interact in World War I, the way they do all their trade deals, the way everybody owes them money by the end of the war. The United States basically economically, I always put it to people when I talk to them about it, is the United States wanted the economic global benefit without having to have any of the responsibility of what that means from an internationalist perspective. They wanted the ability to make all the money globally, but at the same time wanted no responsibility over anything else internationally, and just assume the money would keep rolling in. We don't have to be part of any other part of the global economy. You all, global world, you do you, but just pay us money, and that's all we want. America is not, in my view, an isolationist country. America is an economic global juggernaut, and it's a negligent country when it comes to its international relations, I'd argue, because it really tries to just do the bare minimum while having maximum payback, and is staggered when it backfires.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of this stems from the origins of America. Again, we're going well off topic here, but they are defined as being anti-imperialist. They rebelled from the British Empire. They fought to get out of it. And in the psyche of the Americans, they don't do empire like the British do. And so, so what they end up doing is seeking out the benefits of empire without having either the name empire or the commitments of cultural and social empire. They just want the economic aspects of it and the benefits. And in their mind, that makes sense. Why can't we do the good bits of empire without ignoring the bad bits? Let's have a crack at it. Here, I'll sell you my stuff. I'll buy your stuff. Oh, hold on a second. This is still exploitation.
So in terms of the Depression and the way that oppression operates, let's talk about Herbert Hoover. So Hoover, obviously, we've mentioned before that Hoover believed firmly in this idea that he should do something. But he couldn't do anything because, again, this idea of let the magic of the market run itself was so ingrained. So he tries to do things like he tries to cut taxes as his first sort of move, very tentative move. He starts the Committee for Unemployment Relief, which is designed to try to work out ways to give people some level of benefits. They still don't want to give benefits out, but they're trying really hard to come up with a way to do it around. He gives a lot of money to start this idea of the schemes that would eventually be turned by Roosevelt into the alphabet agencies. He tries to come up with the first way to do that. It's a lot of money that he gives to start things like, for example, Hoover Dam. You know, the idea of let's get some works projects going. The problem is when he does things like Hoover Dam, it's not so much government putting the money in, it's government paying private firms to still do this because business needs to be taken care of. And the problem is he tries something which looks a lot like what ends up being the alphabet agencies, but he's not prepared for the government to be in competition with private enterprise. And he wants private enterprise to lead the way. But as we've seen, private enterprise struggles with this, and there's a profit to be had, and that's the bigger issue. So it sort of stagnates because it has a minimal bump. But if you're still putting it in the hands of business, there's not going to be altruistic reasons for doing it.
I think Hoover, while we said was probably the right man for it, ended up having the wrong ideology for it. It's I think his ideology was probably founded on the notion of tough love, that, you know, you people got yourselves into this, you can get yourself out of it. Too bad. The government isn't in the business of competing for business. And that's a defining feature of Republican economic policy at this point. It's the criticism of government getting involved in the work of business is that either the government has too much advantage on its side that they will crowd out actual competitive businesses and beat the common man at their own work, or alternatively, the government is so inefficient at private industry that to put them in there is to waste the taxpayers' money. So why not? Why do that business? Give a tax cut instead. So the ideas of why the government shouldn't get too involved in private enterprise, while dichotomous on that notion, are the central plank that private business will lead the recovery.
Now, again, as we said, Hoover himself, though, has views that don't always align with the Republican Party. He does things like, for example, the Davis-Bacon Act, which is that idea of encouraging that the union wage is what should be paid and don't scrimp on the money. Whatever the agreed union wage is, that's what the payment should be. They also try things like, for example, Norris LaGuardia, which is about protecting the trade unions at this point in time. They also eventually, he passes in 32 the Emergency Relief Act. But it's $300 million for unemployment pay. But it's a bit, but compared to what is out there, it's nowhere near enough economically. But as I said, the problem for Hoover is he wants to do things, but he kind of doesn't want to do them in such a way that's going to anger the Republican base, because he still believes he's going to win re-election, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
But Hoover is doing this going, I need to run as the Republican candidate for election, and I need to be able to win this election. Now, anybody looking at what was going on is going to look at this and go, what do you mean you thought you were going to win an election? Right? There's no hope you were going to win this election. But he believed that he could win the election. He firmly believed in this election coming up. And he believed that he was the man who was going to be able to lead the American economy out of this by holding to Republican ideals, by at the same time showing compassion. Now, the moment that ruins it for him completely, if we're not talking about the Great Depression ruining it, is the bonus army. The bonus army is remarkable because Hoover does all of the right things on the lowdown and then botches the public face of it horrifically. So 20,000 unemployed soldiers in World War I turn up to Washington in 1932. There was an agreement that their war pension was going to be paid. I think it was 38 was when the war pension was due to be paid. They go, we're in economic crisis. We need our war pension paid early. But pay out the war pension early so we can then, keep ourselves afloat now. Now, Hoover initially privately met with them and said, I'll feed you. We'll make sure you've got food. We'll make sure you've got supplies. We'll make sure you can set up camp and sort of, be healthy. But that eventually gets replaced with this idea of this is a bad look. Now, Thomas, if you were running public policy and there were heroes of the United States asking for what is owed to them, how do you avoid problems?
Look, based on my experience with this, deep and wide experience in public relations management, I think first thing I would do is call in the army and the police and shut down these rebel rousers. These heroes are not heroes. They're betrayers. They're not being true and faithful to the American dreams and ideals. They're impatient queue jumpers. Let's go and beat them up. And that will resonate with the American public, who is increasingly unemployed, increasingly destitute, increasingly impoverished. Me going and beating up returned servicemen and veterans of the Great War that saved the world and built America for the prosperity that we all want to get back, beating them up and blooding them up, that's the way to do it.
What I find really important about that too is it demonstrates the people you're paying currently in the army are worth that money. And I feel like that is the smart move to make. No, Herbert Hoover decided to turn the army on the previous army that had fought a world war and drives them out in a very violent and aggressive thing using guns and tear gas. At this point in time, the Democratic candidate for president, a guy called Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who we are about to spend several podcasts talking about, said to his aides privately, I just won this election. And yeah, I mean, look, let's reflect on Hoover before we move on to the election, before we move on to what Roosevelt does. Hoover, as we said, is a man without a country. The Republicans don't really like him. He doesn't really like them, but he's not prepared to completely turn on the Republican Party. They're not completely prepared to abandon him. It's this horrible dysfunctional relationship where Hoover is a good man who understands what needs to happen, but lacks the political will and ability to do it. And what you needed realistically was you needed an election, regardless of if you are a Republican or a Democrat and whatever your political views are. This is one of those situations where you needed a change in government because it's a chance to reset public policy.
Yeah, the change in government is more of a psychological thing that's needed than anything else. Irrespective of what the economic policies are they bring to the table, I'm probably selling myself out here, I think either side could have geared a recovery knowing what we know about World War II. And that's not to say World War II ends the Great Depression, because I'm not on that camp. But World War II does a great thing in bringing on the final chapters of the Great Depression. I think the Republicans would have softened, and FDR, we know what he does. So irrespective of who wins, I think a recovery comes about, just in different manners. The thing that needs to change, though, is in the minds of the Americans. If you are under the leadership of the same Muppets who got you into the situation, on what green earth are you going to have faith in those people to actually lead you out of it? And so it's the changing of the guard that's needed more than anything else. And
I think this is the general mood within the United States, is we need to get ourselves out of this, and they have not demonstrated. And remember, we're dealing with a Hoover presidency. Again, he begins his presidency in 1928. He gets less than a year before the economy collapses. So the majority of Hoover's presidency is managing the Great Depression. And it's safe to say that by the time you get to the end of his management of the Great Depression, by the end of his term, there's not much evidence that he's actually going to be able to get them out of it. Right? As we said, he's made some movements, but every time he makes those movements, he's met with fierce opposition from the Republicans, especially the Republicans in Congress, who are still not willing to accept that different moves need to be made. Again, look at Smoot-Hawley, right? They are not prepared to make the adjustment that even if they go, it's temporary, we are going to go back to what we believe, but this is a fix that's needed. Rather than take the fix, take the brief hit, but then go back to your policy, maybe with some adjustments, they just stick. And again, in a stick and twist scenario where sticking is clearly going to get you killed, you would think that even politically, the Republicans would have been smart enough to go, we've got to twist here. We have to twist.
Yeah, I see so many parallels in this election of 32 with very recent elections, particularly the 07-08 campaigns of McCain and Obama, and then the Biden-Trump most recent. Yeah. And taking the McCain-Obama one, so unpopular was Hoover, FDR only had to not stuff it up. It was his to lose. In much the same way Obama just had to present and not screw up, not present any gaffes, and just maintain a positive air, because so unpopular was George Bush that McCain was never a chance. No. So unpopular was Donald Trump that Biden just had to look competent to beat that. And so here we had the same with FDR. He just had to look and sound like he cared and look and sound like he had a plan. So unpopular was Hoover that the people would flock to him.
And this is the thing. This is it's a global one where if the government appears incredibly incompetent, the way you defeat an incompetent government is say nothing.
Yep.
Hoover, and as a result, Roosevelt in the campaign makes absolutely zero policy statements. There is not a single piece of policy that passes Roosevelt's lips. There is not a single plan. All he talks about is this idea of we need to change things up. He doesn't tell anybody how he's going to do it. He doesn't tell anybody what his planning is. All he does is sort of sit back and let the Republicans and Hoover talk themselves out of office. Right? So nobody really knows what Roosevelt stands for. They just know he's not Herbert Hoover.
He does have his record as governor of New York to rest on, and in that point, he'd been an interventionist. He had been a relief builder or relief program builder. He had tried to minimize the effects of the Great Depression for the people of New York, and that being the epicenter of the financial catalyst that started it all. He had enough to point back to where he had a great air of legitimacy without having to point forward and say, and this is how I'm going to scale up what I just did.
And it's really interesting as well, because obviously a lot of the building programs that happen in New York. And it's really interesting because obviously he gets the things like the Empire State Building happens in this time, completed in 1931. But like part of that was part of the Hoover money. So it's really interesting that, of course, Roosevelt gets the kudos for things like Empire State Building. But there was partly Hoover as well. It was a general sort of thing, but because it's New York and Roosevelt is the one who's seen, it helps. And so when we get to the federal election, the election in 1932, it will not surprise people to note that the Electoral College vote is 472 to 59. There are 42 states carried by Franklin Roosevelt, 6 by Herbert Hoover. I'm kind of always remarkably amazed that he carried 6.
6 is a pretty good achievement, I would say, especially some of those 6. Pennsylvania is a monumental achievement for him.
Yeah, it's an interesting, when you go through and have a look at the state by states in 1932, it's a remarkable map of the United States that you end up getting, because you look at where you think he might have won, where he didn't. Again, Pennsylvania is at the time worth 36 Electoral College votes. Think about it, he only got 59. 36 of those come from Pennsylvania.
I think the percentage of the vote is also crucial here. It's a nearly 20% difference, 57 to 39. That's insane that you would see that much of a raw vote distribution in an American election, especially these days where it's decided by 4% or less.
I think the other interesting thing, before we move on, the other interesting thing I think we need to note is that the voting turnout was down by just over 4%.
I think that reflects the loss of faith in the institution. Whereas these days we used to see, at least in American elections, used to seeing a 60% turnout as a high point. JFK achieves a monumental turnout of Americans voting for 60%, 6 in 10 people voting. Here, the downturn, whenever you see a downturn, I usually attribute that to people just going, the system shot, my vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter which one of these hunky-dories win. My life is screwed anyway. I'm not invested in the outcome of this, so why do I bother turning out?
And what is really interesting for me as well is that you get, just to quickly look at the elections for 2 seconds before we get into Roosevelt and what he does on the New Deal front. In 1936, in the follow-up election, the vote goes back up by 4%. And Roosevelt's victory is far more complete. He only loses 2 states. Like, that's all he drops in 1936 is 2 states. 60% of the vote. The voting percentage goes up again. And then again, you get another voting percentage, a massive turnout in 1940 of 62%, which is a huge turnout for the United States elections, where Roosevelt wins again by a smaller margin. And we'll come to that in a moment, because you might have just noticed that I said that Roosevelt wins 3. Roosevelt wins 4. Anyway, moving back for a minute, let's get to the man, the myth, the legend himself, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's an interesting character. It's interesting, I find, first of all, and I know your fondness for another Roosevelt. Isn't it interesting that America threw up 2 of these men who were able to sort of have left an indelible mark on the United States?
It's I don't want to say it's a testament to the family, because they're part of the aristocracy of America that we pretend doesn't exist, or at least America pretends doesn't exist. This upper crust of people born into a life where they're trained and prepared for leadership and politics. It exists in America, always have, always will be. The Kennedys are an example of that now, and the efforts of Patrick Kennedy in the first half of the 1900s was to inject his family into that. The Roosevelts are another example of that, where they're born with these notions of personal greatness and that they are a great leader amongst men and can do things that others can't do. You get that with Theodore, and he wears it as a badge of honor that he is an exceptional human being for exceptional times and will lead the nation in such a way that no one else can be. But with that comes a great humility, and you need to stop me before I turn this into a Theodore Roosevelt podcast, because I could go on for hours.
No, I'm giving you your own Teddy one later.
When it comes to Franklin Delano, he's a much more shrewd politician, and I feel as though here that FDR lacks the moral compass and conviction that Theodore has. I mean, for example, I could never imagine Theodore committing adultery. I can never imagine Theodore hiding his own sort of personal weaknesses rather than admitting them and then engaging with them. Whereas you have the likes of FDR in a gentleman's agreement with the media to never talk or photograph him suffering from polio.
Yeah, never show him in a wheelchair.
Yeah, there's these differences between the two, which are interesting to explore and probably a byproduct of the age and the era they both grew up in.
I think the thing is that Teddy was a showman, but with a moral compass to back it up. And I think with Roosevelt, you get probably the smoothest politician that's entered the office at this point in time.
Yep.
You get a man who is very much, we use the word political animal a lot. Franklin Roosevelt turns himself into the ultimate political animal. It's one of the things I really admire about the man, and not saying the lack of a moral compass is a good thing. On the contrary, but if you look at where he begins, and we talked about it obviously in the last podcast, and we talked about working for Woodrow Wilson, and then the way that he sort of rehabilitates his own image. He tries to run as vice president on nominee at one point. Then he goes back to be governor of New York to try to get himself into a position of power. It works. When he gets himself up for the election in 1932, I think a lot of people would have gone, well, good luck anyone coming into this office right now.
Yeah, you want it, you can have it.
And what he's done, as I said, yes, as you said, he had a history in New York of getting involved as an interventionist, but it's a bit different. And I know New York is the largest economy at this time still. California is growing, but it's still the largest economy. I know there are lots of similarities, but to not basically give anyone a clue of what you're actually going to do leading into this, you take office, and then obviously at his inaugural, he talks about the New Deal for Americans.
Yeah.
But he doesn't really outline what the hell that means. And a lot of historians will argue, by the way, that the reason he doesn't outline what this means is twofold. One, he doesn't really know.
Yeah, he doesn't even know what it means.
Because he hasn't sat down yet with everybody and got a really good look at the books. He doesn't quite know exactly what they do or don't have. He doesn't exactly know what he's going to be able to do. A lot of people point at the fact that the New Deal is not progressive. Wait till you get to the second one. Because he needs to stabilize. So the New Deal is fascinating for me, because the New Deal is a lot of bluff and a lot of showmanship. There is solid policy behind it, but there's a lot of bluff and showmanship that goes into selling the New Deal. And it starts, really, for me, with the bank holiday. So an absolute masterstroke, and something that needed to happen, because he wins the election, obviously, but then you've got the lame duck period. And in that lame duck period leading into the start of 33, the economy tanks further. It's going further away from where he needs it to be. People are starting to make runs on banks, and as was legally their right, demanding their money in gold. Because as we said, the gold standard is a thing. Roosevelt knows that he needs to stop the banks falling apart and is trying to work out desperately how to do it.
Because by this time, 40% of all banks in America have become insolvent and shut down.
Yep. And so he's got a massive issue on his hands. How do you stop this? And what he does is he takes office, passes the Emergency Banking Act, and closes the banks for 4 days.
Lockdown.
In that time, he basically sends in federal inspectors to basically go, can you back your money? If you can't back your money, we're closing you. And what he does is it's not so much about actual regulation, because the 4 days aren't enough to actually regulate banking. But what he does is give the public enough confidence that if your bank reopens, it's okay. And most of this, when I say bluff, what I mean is it's about, we've just gone through a decade and a bit of prosperity, which was largely telling everyone you were prosperous. Roosevelt knows there's economic reform that has to happen, but he can't do that initially. What he has to do instead is bluff for a bit.
Yeah. With that, inspectors going into banks and trying to figure out, what do banks actually sit on? Out of that comes the concerns that we can't let this happen again. We need oversight and regulation. That's where we get the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, where they go, if a bank doesn't have the liquid capital to survive a run, we, the bank, will insure the consumer's deposits, which is something that was a hallmark of the 2007-2008 global recession. And I certainly remember it happening here in Australia, where the government said, if a bank goes under, we will honour your deposit and, bring us your latest bank statement. We'll give you that same money back. Yep. And it's that one of those central planks that returns a great degree of trust to the financial sector. And that all of this comes out of the 33 Bank Act, where so many little pieces of law and reform stick with America and provide such a blanket of security for the next 50 years that's how they avoid another of these big things. Ironically enough, it's the windback of some of these laws in the 1990s that lay the groundwork for the Great Recession of 2007-2008, particularly Glass-Steagall.
Exactly. The other thing we talk, as I said, when I'm talking about bluff and bluster, the PR moves that he makes are quite clever. The fireside chat, right? Everyone has lost confidence in government. They've lost confidence that government is listening. They've lost confidence that government cares. Roosevelt engages in this series using the brand new innovation of the wireless. He engages with the public in these fireside chats where he basically gives a weekly update as to what the hell's going on, right? And sometimes it's a pure political statement. Sometimes it just feels like a general conversation. He also made sure that if people rang the White House, they weren't cut off. They were put through. He also responded to everyone's letters. Like there's over 8,000 letters sent. He responds to all of them. How much he actually personally wrote, up for grabs. But it doesn't matter. People have the impression that they're listening. This is, again, restoring confidence. So he understood that the most important early steps were not the policy. That was to come. The initial phases were confidence. The one thing that he does that is seen as being, just it's a feel-good moment, but in reality is economically much smarter, is the repealing of prohibition. Now, a lot of people only talk about that as a feel-good moment for social benefit, but think about the taxation money you're about to make, right? One of the things that I always find remarkable is when the Republican Party were desperate to make money and keep money coming into the economy, they didn't go, let's repeal prohibition, because we can spark more agricultural work again through hops and those sorts of things. And secondly, taxation means we can make money off the sale of alcohol and prop the economy up. And Roosevelt, removes it and infamously says, I need a drink. But again, it's a feel-good moment, but also economically, it's quite clever.
I think that's the classic PR moment. I mean, anyone who thought prohibition was working, it was just living under a rock. All it did was create a black market for booze and made criminals richer and made drinking less of an easier social ill to combat, because now you're doing it secretly and illegally, and all of a sudden...
And that's why they got Capone on tax.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't declaring his earnings. And again, this is where you think about it and go, well, if you were selling the alcohol, if people...
You'd have the tax.
You'd have that tax.
Yeah. So getting rid of that. And then there's also... and maybe this is from the Australian perspective here, but at the end of the week, after you've done a week's worth of work, who's the government to tell you how you're going to wind down for the weekend? Yes, I suppose there's the social ills and mores of drinking, but at the end of the day, who is the government to tell you what you're going to do with your money and what you're going to do with your time? And that's where I think the ironic thing comes, that the Democrats who are in favour of big government are the ones to repeal this, and the Republicans who are in favour of small government are the ones who enacted it.
Yeah, it's if you look at it if you're a Republican looking at the policy of prohibition, it's ridiculous. It's a stupid policy that doesn't seem to match. Again, it's that push for that early women's vote with the temperance union, which sets the Republican Party back significantly in terms of the way they actually push forward with public policy, because they're listening to that voice, thinking that voice was a majority, which it was not a majority. They were just loud and vocal. The last thing in terms of confidence before we move into the actual what happens is the Securities and Exchange Commission starts to actually oversee the stock market, what they're supposed to do. And they start bringing in rules about insider trading, and they start bringing in rules about speculation, and they start bringing in rules to stop brokers basically fleecing people.
Yeah, I mean, given that they were created in 1934, it's a well overdue regulatory commission there. What is missing from all of laissez-faire is any sense that there is a firm right or wrong. The idea that the market will just take care of these things, it's just absurd for us in a largely sort of socialist government era to think that there was ever a time where it was a rational thought to think the government will take care of itself. If the customer doesn't like you being illegal, they'll go find someone else to buy their goods from. If the customer doesn't like you being a criminal, they'll just go and find somewhere else. No, there needs to be regulation to tell people what is right or wrong, so that at least you can have a degree of confidence in the system.
So we'll get on to the big ticket item of the New Deal in a moment, which is the alphabet agencies and things like that. I do want to go back to the gold standard for 2 seconds, because a lot of people will tell you about, FDR comes in and the gold standard goes away. The gold standard goes nowhere. What FDR does with the gold standard, though, is far more clever. So first of all, you couldn't go off and just demand the gold. The gold actually had to be deposited. That's the first thing. The second thing is, he then goes, well, the bank shouldn't be holding the gold realistically, because if the bank goes on, what happens? So the government needs to hold the gold on behalf of the banks. So it goes, the government can then say, we have the security for the banks. The banks don't have their own security. We have it. Confidence. We've got the money. We're good for it. It also increases the price of gold. And by raising the price of gold goes from 20, I think it's about $20 an ounce, to it's about 35. By doing that, it means that the value goes up. So it also increases the amount of the government reserves now, because that value is higher. It also means that people from overseas want to start investing in America again, because the gold's worth more. So it increases their want to invest. So it actually brings more investment money in. So he doesn't get rid of the gold standard, but he just makes the gold standard a bit more flexible than it had been previously. And again, a lot of the problems of the Great Depression come from inflexible policy. And what he does is just makes it a little bit more flexible.
Yeah, you couldn't get rid of the standard. It was the defining argument of politics at that time. So there was no way he was ever going to just abolish it, despite the radical things that he does do in other areas. But the sneakiness of it is very good. Again, coming back to him being a political creature. But the other side, or the unintended consequence, is that 80 years later, all the conspiracy theorists on Twitter will talk about how there's actually no gold in Fort Knox, and the government just took it and spent it all, and that's why you can't do it. And that's why we need to audit Fort Knox, and that's why we need to audit the gold reserves, because they lost it all and it's not actually there.
I would love to see Roosevelt in a time of Twitter. He would have a field day.
Fireside tweets.
Oh, great. The fireside tweet would be amazing. The fireside.
Well, hold on. Didn't we see an American president run his entire campaign and life through Twitter for a period of time recently?
You got banned. Fireside TikToks would be amazing. So that could be brilliant. So let's get on to the economy now and what he actually does. So socially, there's a big move in that child labor is banned. Child labor laws come in.
Boo.
Now, while you might boo on that one, the reason why the child labor laws are moved is not actually because of any moral children should not be working. But if children aren't working, adults need to take those jobs. So it increases employment within the economy. So morally, yeah, he might have said children shouldn't be working, but in reality, it's another way to put more adults in jobs. No more children working.
But what will the kids do with all this extra free time?
I know. Maybe they should go to schools. No, not you, young African-American child. We'll save that for later. We will come back to that one. the alphabet agencies, let's talk about them, because they are the big ticket item, and anyone who's ever done America at school will know all about the alphabet agencies. The better headline with the alphabet agencies is that it's the government deciding that the only way to create jobs is to create the agencies to create the jobs, or to regulate the agencies to create the jobs. But what it does represent is a shift in public policy. The government has never previously been in competition with private industry. And things like the most obvious example, the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, enter into direct competition with private firms.
Yeah, the TVA is one of those banner agencies off FDR. The Tennessee Valley Association could only be done at the federal level, given the Tennessee Valley spans something like 8 to 10 different states. So it's a huge thing. And at this time, people in Tennessee Valley, no roads, no electricity, no running water, not even a thought of a phone. Like, it is so
lots of flooding because their rivers were unchecked.
Yeah. If anyone was expecting private enterprise to go, there's a sound investment, they were kidding themselves. And that's why it was so undeveloped while the rest of America was developed. It is proof that private business isn't in it for the social good. They're only in it for themselves and the profit. So you need these agencies to do this.
Like
the Tennessee Valley.
21 dams in 10 years.
Yeah. There's no one's going to do that. Hoover got one.
No, exactly. And it was named after him.
Yeah.
But what I love about that too is, again, a lot of the policies of this, and a lot of those dams and a lot of the hydro that starts to go in at this point in time too, still in use to this day. Still running large swathes of this part of Middle America. You can still see the effect. Again, the fact they didn't, as you said, no electricity, no roads, no running water, nothing. And suddenly the things like the TVA go in. Now, again, this did see them get legally challenged. There were lots of court challenges to the New Deal.
The relationship between FDR, the law, and the Supreme Court is such a fascinating story. So good.
Yeah, so let's talk about Roosevelt, because Roosevelt and the Supreme Court, as you said, it's a fascinating relationship, but that's putting it mildly. So it was popular with the public at large.
Yes.
Wasn't popular with private enterprise who felt they were being shafted. Wasn't popular with the Republicans who were worried about what it meant for private enterprise and laissez-faire economics. So he got challenged in the Supreme Court. They ruled that the National Recovery Administration and that everyone's favorite, the AAA, were illegal because they took away the right of the states to manage themselves. We go back to this bloody states' rights issue. The NRA had also been attacked by businessmen who thought that it was a waste and it was expensive. Now, that's code for we'd like that money, please. So Roosevelt, who at this time has been very moderate in the way that he's approached the economy and moderate in the way that he's approached legal challenges, kind of decides to just go for broke. And he challenges the Supreme Court and threatens to replace any judge that doesn't agree with him. And his second New Deal, which he implements as part of his re-election campaign, goes further left than I think the Republicans believed he would.
Well, I love the Supreme Court. Well, the history of the Supreme Court in and of itself is a fascinating topic. But right here it's classic because FDR inherits a conservative Supreme Court, not just like a 5-4 majority or something. It's a 7-0. The Supreme Court is 7 Supreme Court justices at this point. It is a wholly conservative body. 7-0
including several judges who, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, had been put forward as potential Republican presidential candidates.
Yeah, it was no disguise. It was a Republican, a conservative venture. And so as the first New Deal is getting knocked off one by these lawsuits, FDR goes, okay, you want to play the PR campaign? I'll play the PR campaign. He comes out and proposes that he expand the court by 8 justices to 15 and says, I'll appoint 8 in one go. And he starts to reel off the notion that he will just appoint the most 8 progressive left-wing justices so that none of these other justices ever have a say in the future. He also threatens to impose a retirement age of 70 or older on all the justices. And it turns out all of them are 70 or older, so they'd all have to retire and they could be appointed by replacement. So that's another way. Now, the Supreme Court, rather than functioning as a court, functions then as their own PR body and goes, well, I like my job and I like doing this. Maybe we need to meet FDR halfway. And that's why the second New Deal holds up so well, because they realize if we tear it down like we did the last time, we're going to lose our jobs and the Supreme Court itself will be largely neutered for the rest of the life. And this all goes back, and this is a deep dive in American history, to the establishment of the court, and in 1803, the establishment of the judicial review process by the Supreme Court, where in Marbury versus Madison, the decision was, is Congress or the Constitution more important? If Congress passes a law and it doesn't stand up to a constitutional challenge, then it gets struck down. And it's the embodiment of this machination in 1933-34 that will come back and bite America for the next 70 years up until today. It's why the politics of the Supreme Court now are so important, because of what happened first under FDR, but then a little bit further back in 1803.
And what I find really interesting about it too is there's a lot of the hypotheticals. Well, would he have actually done it? I don't know if he would have actually done it, but I think he would have at least walked really far down the path to get there and maybe start appointing new. I don't think he would have appointed the extra justices. I think the retirement age thing would have swung though. So I think that would have been the more likely of the two reforms. Anyway, it doesn't get to that point because they basically, as Thomas said, realize I like my job. I like having a job. I like justice me. I am a justice. I should be justice for a long time. And so they start not finding completely in his favor, but they start actually approaching them as a case by case in legitimacy rather than a just, no, we don't agree with you. We don't agree with your political stance. They start using the Constitution. What he does is he brings up new bodies to replace the ones that have now been declared illegal. So the National Labor Relations Act comes in 1935, which is the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act basically comes in and protects the right to join a union and sets up the Labor Relations Board, which basically says if your workplace is victimizing you, go to the Labor Relations Board and they will hear your case. So it's giving workers a say. He gets rid of the AAA and brings in the Soil Conservation Act instead, which basically says, yeah, we can keep giving farmers money. You know, we're going to keep paying farmers to produce crop, and we're going to pay them a wage, a guaranteed wage to keep the farms running. The Social Security Act is the big one, 1935. So it is the big ticket item of the Second New Deal. Now, by the way, it's really important to understand Roosevelt himself hated the idea of Social Security. He makes no bones about it. He thought that Social Security meant that people would be less likely to go and want to get work. He was worried about the idea of people just taking payments for not working. So he wasn't as progressive on that in terms of he believed it was something that, you know, they should be doing. But he understands by 1935, it's needed and it's essential, and that the absolute bottom end of society needs to be taken care of. So as much as personally he doesn't necessarily believe in it, he understands it's a necessity for the United States to come out of the Great Depression.
Yeah, this is where Roosevelt, the pragmatic politician, wins, and Roosevelt, the dogmatic ideologue, loses in his own mind. Is it better to pass a popular bill that will improve the lives of people, probably have negative consequences in the long run, but A, keep me elected, B, keep other Democrats elected, and C, provide a degree of recovery and stability? Or should I stick to my guns like the Republicans did and just not change from my personal ideology, which is X, Y, and Z? And the pragmatic politician wins out, which for the long run of America was a good thing. Social Security is still there and has saved so many people from impoverished lives.
And it's things like, you know, old age pensions. It's things like physical disability. It's things like making sure that children are taken care of. It's things like unemployment insurance, right? All of these aspects, like they weren't things. They didn't. That's children had to work. There was no policy of taking care of children in need.
It's the creation of the welfare state as we know it.
The National Housing Act comes in as well, which is eventually to give loans to people to start buying houses and cuts down rents that are way too big. And by the end of it in 1938, of course, you get the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the hours and conditions of work and a minimum wage. So again, this idea of bringing all of these things in, there are ways to sort of, make adjustments to the economy. Now, the question we have to ask is, does the New Deal actually do what it says on the tin? Now, this is a historical debate that you will not find historians that completely agree on this one.
No, never.
The arguments that are made are that basically democracy holds in the United States, first of all, whereas in other countries it sort of fell to pieces as a result of this. People suddenly had infrastructure, which they hadn't had before. If nothing else, the New Deal is significant because it gives America infrastructure it desperately lacked. And if you want to look at reasons why America can become the power it is about to merge into, that infrastructure is vital to any country becoming a major power. The ability to move, the ability to have products move around, the ability to produce things. That is vital infrastructure for any country, and America lacked it. It's one of the things that had held America back was that lack of infrastructure. So the New Deal gives them a lot of that. It also does things like overhaul systems that are needed, things like we said, the financial sector, banking, and the stock market in particular. And it also gives something else in terms of the popularity of Roosevelt. It's something that it's not really been seen for a long time in the United States. Teddy was the last sort of national figure, and even he had, as we know, and again, we will do a Teddy Roosevelt podcast at some point, I guarantee you, because Thomas is just, you have no idea. But I think FDR, again, he becomes bigger than the government. You ask most people outside of those of us who are absolute historical nerds to name key figures within FDR's administration. They name FDR.
FDR is the administration.
It is it. For all intents and purposes, FDR is his administration. And the fact that he runs and wins 4 times. 4, right? This is why they have to eventually bring in the term limit mandatory, because previously everyone just held to the Washington principle of no more than 2. And FDR goes, yeah, but it's going so well. Let's keep it all going. I need to maintain this. And America, rather than going, no, we don't want to re-elect you, think he's popular enough and think he's done a good enough job, they bring him back 4 times. The 4th time in particular is really fascinating, but we're coming to that one in the next episode. The question that I'll ask is, does it end the Depression? Now, an argument you can make about the fact that the New Deal, rather than ending the Depression, simply props the United States up, is that 1937, 1938, FDR decides that it's okay to start removing some of the social supports. And as they pull some of the financial and social supports back, the economy wobbles and starts to tank. And they very quickly throw the money back in. So there is an argument that can be made that the Great Depression is not ended by the New Deal. The New Deal simply protects the United States from its effects until they can build up a stronger economy and economic basis to then move forward.
Yeah, I struggle with the question because there is, I think, 2 parallel questions. Number one, what ended the Great Depression versus what was the intent of the New Deal?
Yep.
Was the intent of the New Deal to end the Great Depression or to cauterize the wound and hemorrhage the bleeding, and then at least provide a stop to the free fall, or at least slow it down to a point where recovery became possible? I don't think too many historians could stand the heat if they argued that World War II didn't, for the large part, end the Great Depression, just purely on the basis that the economic recovery that results from the mobilization and the shift from peace economy to war economy coincides or stimulates the recovery. But I contend that while that might be true, the framework from which that was possible was established by New Deal 1 and 2, and that the recovery may not have come from New Deal 1 and 2, but as you were saying, it provided a floor for things to bottom out and start to recover from, and then provided the levers of power and the sort of buttons to press when World War II comes along, that economic recovery could come hand in hand with war mobilization.
I think it's much like, as we said at the start, it's not as simple as saying that the Great Depression and the stock market crash are the same thing. I don't think you can argue that the end of the Depression is a singular entity. It's a double-barrel entity. The framework exists because of the New Deal, but that framework then needs a catalyst. Much like with the Great Depression, it was always sort of, as we said, 27, 28, it's shaky, 29, it's really wobbly. The stock market crash happens and it falls. Much like that, with this, the framework is put in place by the New Deal. It gives everybody the structure as to this is how we get out. You now need the financial impetus to do it. World War II becomes that financial impetus to get America out of it because of the amount of production, because of things early on, like the way they were selling weapons to things like Britain and the way
Lend-Lease and whatnot.
Again, they come out of World War II financially. You know, they make out very well out of World War II because everyone bought their weapons and they end up owning most of the territory.
Again.
Exactly. So obviously it's an interesting conversation to have there around what happens, but we need to move off, because while most people would go, well, there we go, let's end here, there is a far more pressing and far more important issue that needs to be discussed, and that, of course, is the international side of this. Because we've sort of danced around the idea of international relations in this episode. We've talked very strongly about domestic economic policy, which we've had to, but the lasting impact of this era ends up coming more on the domestic, not on the domestic front, but more on the international front, because the United States, as we know, has argued that they're an internationalist. They're not internationalist. They're an isolationist country. I will maintain they're not. I will maintain they just don't want to do anything, and there's a difference between the two. But what happens in the 1920s and 1930s is that the United States decides that they are going to stay out of things to the point where they allow for a major power on their doorstep to start to grow and start to do things which Americans find morally reprehensible, but are not prepared to risk themselves to intervene with. And I'm talking, of course, about Japan. So post-World War, as we said, post-World War I, as we said in the last episode, they don't join the League of Nations. They stay out of it. They don't want to get involved in global affairs. Well, the problem for the United States is the global affairs come to them. Japan being mightily pissed off about the Treaty of Versailles, being mightily pissed off about asking for a racial equality clause they don't get. As we talked about last episode as well, the Washington Naval Conference, which is an interesting discussion. Japan is sort of feeling like they're being picked on. Japan is also feeling like they're not being given the credit that they deserve for being a major power. And so what you get within Japan internally is you get this development of the military class becoming a political force. And you start to see the military enter themselves into parliament. And they eventually wrangle enough control where they end up running the government. And what you get out of this is a Japanese military going, well, if America doesn't want to be involved globally, and we believe we need an empire, why don't we just take the damn thing? And the first port of call, they look at two areas. First of all, they're looking at Korea, obviously, which is, ask Koreans how that goes whenever you mention Japan. But secondly, and far more importantly, they're looking at China, because Britain is no longer as influential in China as they once were. They still run it, but they're not really worried because they're still trying to deal with the fallout from World War I. And Japan see this as a natural stepping stone. And so Japan starts to increase their influence over China, first of all with economics in terms of the companies, but secondly, the invasion of Manchuria.
Yeah, you got to remember, there's such a cobweb of trying to explain what's going on, certainly on the western frontier of American power in Asia. It's so difficult to unpack because in some sense, it stretches all the way back to pre-modern era and the relations between China and Japan going right back to the BC era and then coming all the way forward. I mean, you referred to Korea there. It's been the football between China and Japan for thousands of years. Who will control it? It's the proxy war between the two of them every time they need to flex their muscles. But if we at least put a start of the escalating tensions firstly between China and Japan and then America and Japan at the Meiji Restoration, where the emperor is re-established as the supreme authority in the 1860s. From then on, it's growing tension at simmering rates, to the point where China and America have the first Sino-Japanese War in the late 1890s, and then the second Sino-Japanese War begins in the 1830s, which is where we're at now. But Japan's situation through all of this is very problematic. They see themselves as of equal status to the West, especially as a winning side or on the winning side of World War One. They then get a decade of what they perceive as cultural and social disrespect, whether it be the migration laws of the United States, which ban Asians, in particular Japanese, from migrating in, or the Washington naval powers deciding a 5-5-3 ratio, which actually favors Japan more than anything else. Then there's the rice famine, the tariffs, this perceived disrespect that they are continually on the receiving end, that turns them away from looking up to and trying to side up with America and Britain, to then going, if you don't respect us, we'll make you respect us, and we're going to take the steps that you yourselves took in Africa and in Australia and in America before it was America. We're going to do what you did. You set the example, so we're going to go in and do these things that you did. Getting to that point takes a lot of intrigue, and the domestic situation in Japan is just as complex. They've got a fledgling democratic system. They've only after World War One truly embraced the notion of democracy, but in much like the situation of Germany after World War One and their first attempts at true and free democracy, it falls on its ass completely. That there's these coalition parties in and out of office, unstoppable elections because it's always falling apart. And so, again, much like Germany, when it all falls together in a heap with the Great Depression, the Japanese turn very quickly to the military strongman who had all this time been promising a better future, a return to greatness, but you're just not listening. You're caught up in this democracy fad. Okay, we'll wait our time, but when it all falls apart and you come running back to us, we'll know exactly what to do. So we'll just sit here and wait.
And the thing with Japan is that Japan has been trying, the other thing that sort of cuts Japan off again is, like everything else, the Great Depression. Because Japan is reliant very strongly on international trade. Because they don't have the natural resources of most other countries that are trying to, empire build. That's why they're empire building. So Japan is looking around. One, it's about respect, but two, it's about Japan going, we need some resources, and you kind of we don't have them. So they're trying to trade. And as trading gets more complicated with America, especially, they look around and go, well, why don't we just build our own empire so we don't have to borrow resources from other people? We just have them. So they look at China and go, well, it's rife for the taking right now.
It's rife for the taking because it's falling apart. They've just had their under Sun Yat-sen, had their rebellion against the emperor and overthrown the monarchy and established a nationalist movement. But then that nationalist movement quickly falls into two camps, the nationalists, which largely get embodied by Chiang Kai-shek, and then the communists, who we all associate with Mao Zedong, but he's actually a minor figure in the early years. And it's this civil war that breaks out between these two, arguing or fighting over what China should be now that we no longer have the emperor. That then Japan goes, here's the perfect time to strike. It is falling apart. They won't be able to defend all their borders. So let's use Korea as our launching pad into the north and go for Manchuria.
So they go into Manchuria, and obviously the League of Nations decides to come down very firmly on this, doing a stern warning, which is about the equivalency of what the League of Nations can do. Now, Japan is not stupid. They understand what the League of Nations can and can't do. Their response to the censuring of their action in Manchuria is to leave the League of Nations.
Just walk out, pick up, and take your ball home.
We're trading with so many other people. We don't actually need you.
Well, as long as they have Manchuria, which is set up as a puppet state, as long as they've got that, they've got access to all the materials up in Manchuria, all the raw materials, which is now Manchukuo as the puppet state. The the fake emperor, who they go and instill and say, this is the rightful emperor of China. They put him in charge of Manchuria, essentially. And then he just signs off everything, saying all the Japanese wants they can have. And then the army is propping the whole thing up and pushing at the borders into Outer Mongolia, which is really a satellite state of the USSR at this time, and into the borders of China, getting ready for the next launching pad.
Yep. And so you get Japan sort of are pushing quite firmly. They're trying to push around on those borders to see what the margins are. Roosevelt is worried. He's very worried about this, but he still has, even though he's, so popular and so much in control, a hostile Congress, a hostile Senate, and a hostile public who do not want to get involved.
Well, all of this starts under Hoover as well. So it's a burning dumpster fire handed over to Roosevelt. I mean, the Mukden incident, which we won't go into in any great detail, but is used as essentially a flare point or a fire up for Japan to get stronger against China and invade Manchuria even more. That happens in 31, so under Hoover. And it's Hoover's focus and then FDR's focus on the domestic, which says everything, that nothing can be done internationally until the domestic situation is sorted out. And the people who can't feed themselves are not going to rally behind a war to defend the Chinese just for the purpose of the moral argument.
Exactly. And so you've got Roosevelt is concerned for a couple of reasons. One, he can sort of see this Japanese aggression and sort of can see where it's heading. And a lot of the national security advisors are saying the same thing. Look, they're planning something. Now, what America is more concerned about, however, is that they're very concerned about the Philippines. Now, the Philippines obviously is not America's per se, but it sort of is. But they're concerned, but they're not concerned. They're like, well, that's probably where they're going to go. But America can't, of course, build new bases because they restrict themselves under the Washington Naval Treaty, which ends up, again, shooting America. We talked about this last episode. They shoot themselves in the foot. While they limit the number of ships that Japan can have, they also stop themselves from being able to build new bases in the Pacific. So Japan can do whatever the hell they want. And who's going to stop them? And the answer is nobody. So they're starting to push at those borders. The other thing that's making Japan feel more emboldened about their ability to push around is not really about the United States. It's about Germany, because they do a deal with Hitler. They've got a very strong agreement with Hitler in place because they're worried about the Soviet Union. As Thomas says, they're pushing at Manchuria at the borders of Mongolia, which is basically under the protection of the Soviet Union at the time. They push really hard at those borders going, well, Hitler's got our backs here. And this is something that we're fine, we're okay. Hitler's got our backs. 1939, and we'll come to what happens down the other part of the Pacific, but in 1939, Japan suddenly does a double take when the agreement is announced, the non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany is announced, and no country is more shocked than Japan, who stops and goes, what? But that means they can attack us and you can't stop them. What is this agreement? And basically there's a lot of messages from Berlin going, don't panic.
We've got this under control.
We've told them they can't attack you. Don't worry. You're okay. You're covered. But Japan is shitting themselves a little bit about this. Now, where this is going to lead to is going to be more about the next episode because it's where we're going to get to. But it's sort of, this moment means that Japan can't really keep looking inland on China, because the further inland they move on China, they're going to bump into the Soviet Union, and they don't want to bump into the Soviet Union. So it's kind of this moment that becomes pivotal to the whole thing, because this is where they go, well, we could get resources in China, or we look south. If we look south, there's the Philippines, there's Thailand, there's all of Indonesia, which is at the time, again, French Indochina. You've got Indochina as well. You've got the French colony, Dutch East Indies, for Indonesia. All of these things exist, and they've got rubber, and they've got coal, and they've got food, and they've got oil. And I didn't accidentally hit on oil last, because oil, as it so often is is going to be our catalyst. It's going to be our trigger point for where we're going to go. But by 1939, Japan is now fully militaristic. Japan has decided that they're going to go on this militaristic cause. And Japan is now firmly in the planning phase for, well, we're going to have to take Asia. We don't think Britain's going to worry because they're going to be a bit busy. Do we think the United States is going to involve themselves in our affairs? And I think the event that sort of sets the Japanese mindset is the attack on the American boat in China. So I think we need to mention that before we finish up.
Yeah, that's the USS Panay, which, while still 4 years ahead of the outbreak of World War II between America and Japan, it sets the tone for what Japan anticipates being a weaker response from the USA if something were to happen. So the USS Panay, it's an American gunboat that's in China at the time, as Japan invades Nanking, which is in and of itself a story for another time. It gets shelled, damaged, and sunk. Japan claims they didn't know what the boat was. It looked like it was a Chinese boat. Sorry, we didn't see the flag on it. America, you would think, would come down hard and respond in the American way. Turns out they're happy to just take just a bag of cash, essentially, as a payoff to say, let's ignore that this ever happened.
About $2 million. And in fact, there are people within the United States government and the media who are like, we shouldn't have been there. That's not the Japanese fault. Now, this conversation leads to a broader conversation to finish up, which is Roosevelt is worried about Japan. He wants to do something about Japan and stop this Japanese aggression before it gets out of control in the Pacific. But he is very strongly advised that China is not the one that you should pick this fight over. And he's basically told we have kinship ties to China, but we have no economic ties left in China. Our economic concern is Japan. And that is the guiding principle under which America sort of gives a very lukewarm, we'll put some tariffs on you, we'll do a bit of restrictive trade, but we're not going to hit you with anything militarily. We're not going to sort of line up against you in a way that's going to be openly, aggressively hostile. Like, we're going to put some economic sanctions on you so we can show that we mean business. But it's sort of this American reaction coupled with the League of Nations reaction, coupled with this eventual agreement and the worry about the Soviet Union, that leads to Japan working out, well, for the next 5-6 years, what is our policy direction going to be? Are we going to make China the destination, or do we look bigger? And where they're going to head is going to be bigger. And their focus is going to be, well, we don't think America is going to necessarily get involved. So why don't we look at the Philippines? And why don't we look at the rest of the Pacific? But to do that, we need a plan. And that's where we're going to leave it this week. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. It's another long one, but there's a lot to talk about. We've only scratched the surface of a lot of the things in this episode. There will be some things we will come back to later after the fact to do some episodes on. As we mentioned several times in that, I think there's a Teddy Roosevelt podcast that has been dying to get out for years. And I think that's happening. Thomas could happily do 3.5, 4 hours. Easy.
That would be a poor imitation of another person's podcast I listen to that maybe I'll give them credit to some other way, because I can't quite remember who it was, but it was 3 1.5 hour episodes about Theodore Roosevelt's life. And I thought, wow, that person loves Teddy just as much as I do.
Well, you have our next podcast arc, folks. But in the meantime, we've still got several episodes to go on this one. Our next one will be dealing with 39 to 51. Not much happens in there.
No, just a quick breeze.
So not a lot's going to happen in that one. I'm looking down what we've got coming up in terms of the way we're doing this, and the next one's going to be loaded. I think the one after that might be our only quieter episode, because after that, I don't know, it gets a bit busy. So until next time, Thank you very much for listening. Please share this around. Please like it if you like it. Please tell people. Please rate us on iTunes. Do whatever you can to get this out there. We really love doing them, and obviously we're hoping to do a lot more of these into the near future. We've got our next episode coming up very shortly, but until then, we'll talk to you all later.